All right, we're live with your Q&A. I've got Shawn and Steve here to answer any questions that have come through, and there's been quite a few. First off, let's do this panel style. So if there's something that makes sense to jump in on, guys, just jump in. Todd Yates is asking, what kind of storage throughput is required for 4.6K Blackmagic Raw?
That storage throughput, right? Is this not a storage question, Steve?
It is.
I'll tell you how many disks it takes to provide that throughput, Shawn, but I'll let you go ahead and take the data rate on your own codec.
All right. Well, the data rate, it depends on a few things. And just looking at my chart here, we have 7, 8 different codec settings. So there's constant bitrate 5, 8, 12, and 18 to 1, for instance, on the 12K. Q0, Q1, Q3, Q5, these are the constant quality settings. So, basically the trade-off is you've got a constant bit rate on one and you got constant quality, which has a fluctuating bit rate. And the range in the 12K at full sensor is at 5 to 1, 578 megs a second, all the way down to, let's see, we would go Q5, which would be somewhere between, 97 to 413. Now, you asked about the 4.6K, which is going to be, a smaller frame, but essentially we're looking at the same, the same data rates when we're talking about the same bit rate options, but there's just fewer bit rate options, 3 to 1, 5 to 1, 8 to 1, 12 to 1, and then the two constant qualities, which are Q0, Q5.
And that's because of the balance with the less compression on the larger frame size, right? Because we've got more processor we can deal with.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about having to write to those files and re-record to CFast. So the 12K just has a stack of CFast 2.0s in there and writes in tandem. The Ursa Mini Pro 4.6K G2, you can write to, attached SSDs via USB-C as well, just like the 12K. So,
well, and if we're looking at, 560 megabytes per second, even as opposed to bits, that'll fit neatly into a 10 gig line, guys. So storage throughput obviously is going to be, you're going to want to count up your streams, which is why SMS rates things in streams of video as opposed to megabytes or gigabytes a second. So that might be where your codec is, but each codec does interact very differently with storage. So it's important to get the testing done in such a manner where you're actually playing back video streams to get to a hard number so you know where those lines are. And you can find most of, at least the common codecs on our website, studionetworksolutions.com, under the products tab, so you can kind of start the back end. So if I've got 10 editors, each doing one stream, I need 10 streams. If we're doing a lot of multicamming, I may need more. So it's important to understand really how your NLE interacts with that video content, what it's pulling in real time, and things like that to help you spec the storage appropriately. Capacity is secondary to performance in that regard.
Very cool. So let's, one other question here that it's actually the same question, which can go to both of you because your answers are going to be different. Grace Place Church and Michael Dangerfield are asking, what is the minimum system requirement for 8K or 12K, and what system can play back that 12K media in real time? Steve, you want to tackle that first on the storage side, and then Shawn on the actual, processor and all that other fun stuff.
Yeah, sure. On the storage side, it sounds like we're right in that 500 megabyte a second range. So it's just going to depend how many users need to play that back. If it's a single user, one of our 8-disc arrays would easily handle it. 16 disc array is more scalable over time. And again, 10 gig connectivity is what's going to be appropriate there. Now, the other thing you have to remember is there are other parts of the workflow, certainly, that Resolve allow as well. It's not just playing back necessarily and cutting that, but maybe I want to master out or color grade something like an EXR sequence for maximum latitude later to be able to play with HDR and different things. That's going to up your data rate. It's also going to become an image sequence. So what you have to balance there is a wrapped file hits storage and hits a server very differently than an image sequence does. In an image sequence, we're actually opening and closing 24, 30, or 60 files per second based on our frame rate. So once you get into those higher resolutions where you do have the IO penalty as well as the throughput penalty, you're going to push up into the 1400, 1500 megabytes per second required. And that's what's gonna, at that point, you're gonna need to get 25 gig Ethernet to the workstation. But as far as what storage can play it back, as long as you design it properly, lots of storage can play it back. But the other challenge you have then is obviously workflow. And that's where SNS really shines, where we have our unlimited software suite that comes along to be able to help you organize that thing, not just play it back fast enough.
Cool. And Shawn, what you got under the
Yeah.
table there?
Okay, so I mean, essentially, I was not so much underquoting, but at the full rate that we could go with on 12K in Q0, which is the constant quality setting, which fluctuates, it could fluctuate up to 1156, you know, sort of single stream there. Of course, you have to be able to write that to the internal media or to the SSD that you've attached. But to that end, the difference between, say, running with Blackmagic Raw in the system, which is, you know, this ramp file, as opposed to, as Steve mentioned, the frame stack of, you know, gigantic frames that you have to open and close, the equal but inverse operation there, right? Like there's going to be less decoding involved in that, or potentially, you know, less of a hit on the system to decode those necessarily. And then again, you hand off more of that to the storage. So my system in particular, since I know it was going to be a question, and I was tossing that 12K around, I did show that I tossed that 12K around in a 1080 timeline, and then we used the image scaling and all the little tricks that we were doing there. But I'm just working on a 2017 iMac Pro. It's not exactly, you know, a slow system, clearly, but it's not the newest system around. And it did have the 18 core Xeon option, 64 gigs of RAM, and then the 16 gig Vega 64 AMD chip for the GPU. So,
And the other thing you'd mentioned,
particularly special.
yeah, but the other thing you'd mentioned is once you start rendering, you were getting a little bit of noise from underneath the table.
Oh, yeah, well, okay. You know, the power draw for rendering on the system. This system, not as much as another system when I had a different card in there that was really power hungry. But sure, my APC, you know, UPS does scream sometimes when I go into render mode. It'll let me know that I'm rendering. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, that's an important distinction to understand too. There are certain codecs and different things that we would work in where you're transferring the load, right? Sometimes it's harder on the workstation if you're dealing with more compressed codec. Sometimes it's harder on the network and the storage when you're dealing with larger files. But even though it's slightly counterintuitive, I have clients who will upres from some of the more compressed codecs to work in the decompressed because it's easier on their workstation. So if I am engaging in a deeper multicam where I have to decode lots of files simultaneously, it's actually better to store and work with larger file types than the smaller ones that are more compressed and tougher on the workstation. The network I can kind of build out a little more than I can, you know, 20 different workstations in an environment from a cost efficiency perspective. So even though it's more data, you can actually do more with it with slightly less powered machines. I don't have to go out and, you know, crank up GPUs and things like that. That said, Resolve's innate ability to use a GPU for decode will also allow you to work with some of those more compressed codecs more seamlessly than other applications.
Yep, and that also kind of boils down to the thing you were talking about before with frame sequences versus, you know, a wrapped file. Wrapped file is one file.
Yep.
A DPX or EXR sequence of 1 hour worth of media at 24 frames per second, that's about 188,000 files. So that's a lot of opening and closing. So you have to make sure the storage and the network is able to deal with that. But it's going to be a heck of a lot easier on your system. So you're going to have that balance somewhere. It's going to be, you know, a more powerful system, or it's going to be more powerful storage. And the thing also is, if you're going with a more powerful storage, when you need to add things on quickly and you can't get a giant monster render box to add in, you can just toss on something that's a little less GPU intensive for you.
Yeah, and the more powerful storage when we go to upgrade or scale, to your point, Jeff, is one place to upgrade and scale. The more powerful systems are potentially every user of the system is going to need that RAM upgrade or that GPU box or whatever the case may be. So you take your costs and you multiply them across the number of users versus just upgrading the central location. in that regard. So
Most certainly. Forklift upgrades versus bespoke. Question from Michael. Any updates with outputting via NDI, or is it Tico, just Tico or Blackmagic cards? Are there any alternatives to hardware cards?
So from our perspective, we don't typically talk about what might be coming out, so I can't speculate. But obviously we continue to develop new technologies, and with the emerging technologies out there, I would imagine that we have something in the works. But again, there's nothing we can comment on at this point anyway. So Michael might want to ping us offline later and keep checking in, see what we're up to.
Sounds good. Lincoln is asking, are proxies automatically generated after setting things up in project settings, or is there a manual process you have to go through to create proxies?
So there's a generate proxy contextual menu option. So you right click, you can select the media that you want, generate the proxy. You can do the same thing, in fact, to link to external proxies that were already generated. And it's not an automatic process. I mean, you can have the render cache set to automatically cache things after X number of seconds. It's in the project settings, but the optimized media generation and the proxy media generation is a manual process.
and this is where it gets kind of neat, where you can layer the tools of someone like an SNS in alongside Resolve. So our proxy generation is automatic. It's part of the process of indexing for the media asset management, the share browser tool that comes along with Evo on that side. So that those proxies would always be available on and ready to go. And as Shawn said, you can link to pre-existing proxies. So at that point, you could just use our proxy as an edit proxy and kind of layer the tools together to accomplish some of that automation and different things, whether it be through the API or whether it be through a simple watch folder or just on index, the way Evo naturally generates its proxies in an automated fashion. And then those proxies are addressable and downloadable actually now within the new Resolve workflow extension, or the workflow plugin that we just released here on Tuesday. So now you can actually find that stuff inside of the Resolve interface. You don't have to leave, just like you don't have to leave to bounce to Fusion or to Fairlight or Color or whatever.
Very cool. There were two questions from Jimmy, one just clarifying the other. Let me get them kind of together into one thing. What's the best way to utilize two grading monitors for DI coloring? One for P3 and one for doing the Rec 709 version after P3 is approved. And he's asking the P3 question because of the high resolution of the media for DI and features.
Yeah, so it's a question of the hardware then, I guess, if we're talking about how we're going to patch that for video output and Resolve. The Ultra Studio 4K Mini, the Ultra Studio 4K Extreme 3, and the DeckLink 8K Pro cards with PCIe card, they can all do that dual SDI output function. The 4K Mini, 4K Extreme are going to be limited to 2x2K streams, and the 8K Pro can do 2x4K streams. So it depends on the resolution that you require for that. The setup of it requires the appropriate monitoring, and they're all connected via SDI. So basically, when you enable that in Resolve, you send your HDR, your P3 out, the A output of the hardware, and then the B output becomes your Dolby Vision tone map output in that case, to trim down to 600 nits or 100 nits or whatever it is that you have to deliver to.
So and that's the key there that Shawn touched on, HDR and Dolby Vision. You don't normally need two monitors unless you are doing a Dolby Vision grade, because you are looking at your primary HDR or Rec 2020 version, and then you're doing that trim pass on the Rec 709 version or the 100 nit version. And then after that, you still probably need to do another completely separate pass that's going to end up being Rec 709 only, because Dolby Vision says, let's look at the top, let's look at the lowest level of nits, and then we'll be able to do the math in between. So that's the two monitors that are hooked up, and a lot of times folks will just simply live in, in a 3G HD raster for that, because especially when the monitor is really close, in a color bay, you don't necessarily need, 4K imagery to be in that space, because you're in a color grading environment. You're not doing effects work. You're not changing that sort of stuff. So having those two monitors there that's a typical setup. And one thing some folks have done is just simply set up, two different inputs on the same monitor. So you can take a Sony monitor or a Postium or any of those other monitors and set up input A as being your 1000 nit, and then input B as being your 100 nit. Because the reason it's so critical about that being a Dolby workflow is if you hook up two monitors, and even if you've got your 1000 nit monitor and your 100 nit monitor right next to each other, you only have one set of grading controls if it's not PQ, or if it's not HDR plus or HDR10 plus. So the only other way to do that would be to get into trying to figure out, let's set up a stereo timeline and have different controls on each side. Gets extremely messy. So if you're talking about getting into a Dolby workflow, give us a holler at Keycode. I've done those quite a bit. I kind of was involved with some of the stuff at the very beginning with those. I think that was Resolve 14, so a little while back. There's certain ways to do it, and let's get you hooked up right. And then last question that came up, or there are two questions, it's the same sort of thing. Cookie is asking, can you explain the difference in loop jog scrubbing, and how does the playback post-roll work under the timeline header?
So the performance of the loop jog, basically you mark a range. You can leave the tools live and make your trims live with keyboard shortcuts and things like that. I'm sorry, what was the second part of that question again?
The second part of that was, how does the playback post-roll work under the timeline header?
Under the timeline header, playback post-roll. This is, I think that we're just talking about the settings, the preferences that you have. Essentially, it just, from your range, it's like if you were to use the keyboard shortcuts, which I do primarily, there's a play around, and hey, there's my neighbor. There's a play around option that, essentially just uses this pre-roll, post-roll, and you can set that as a preference, kind of define, where it stops, and you can either mark your range in out, or it just uses your preferences to decide how far back to jump when you're looking to play around. I tend to use that in loop mode, so it's just option /, which will play my marked range, or /, which will jump back the number of seconds, roll forward the number of seconds at the end, or this is a preference, and you don't necessarily have to mark things in order to make that work. I tend to just mark my range, trim with nudge, which is the comma period, right? Nudge right, left, etc. For kind of live trimming, things like that.
Very cool. I think that's it on all the questions. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us today, and letting everybody know what's new on both fronts. And if you got any questions, please toss them in the chat. We'll work to get those answered even after the event is over. Or please reach out to us here at Keycode. We can help get you set up with a shared system, or a large system for grading. And just give us a holler. Thanks again, and everybody have a great rest of the week.